Imagine this. On the most important day of your life, your wedding day, you walk into your celebration, only to discover that your ex-wife, now pregnant, isn't just attending. She's working as a bathroom cleaner at your wedding. This isn't random. It's a game-changing secret that will flip your entire life upside down. Stay with us to find out how one hidden truth can destroy everything you've built. David had everything: a fortune, the power, the respect, and the woman of his dreams. His wedding was meant to be the culmination of a perfect life. But as he stood there, in the center of luxury, something inside him was unsettled. A feeling he couldn't shake. Something from his past, buried for years, was about to surface, and it would change his life forever. It was his ex-wife, Sarah. Their marriage ended years ago, a messy split that left both of them scarred. Sarah had never quite recovered from the breakup. Neither had David. He had moved on, of course, or so he thought. But even in his new life, the shadow of his past seemed to follow him. As he looked out at the guests, his fiancée by his side, David couldn't help but wonder how things might have turned out differently. If only they had been able to make it work. If only they hadn't let the cracks in their marriage grow too deep. But it was too late for what if. The past was buried, and David was finally ready to step into the future, until a brief, fleeting thought crossed his mind. Was he truly happy? The wedding was everything David had ever imagined, and more. The venue, a grand estate overlooking the rolling hills, was bathed in golden light as the ceremony began. Guests mingled, sipping champagne, while the sound of a live string quartet drifted through the air. Everything was perfect. David, standing at the altar, was the picture of success. His tuxedo fit him perfectly, and his smile was effortless. He looked out at the guests, all there to celebrate his happiness. But something in the air felt off. There was an unease he couldn't shake, a heaviness that pressed down on him despite the lavish surroundings. As the ceremony progressed, David's gaze kept wandering, almost instinctively, toward the back of the room. He had no reason to be distracted, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't help but feel a tug, a sense of discomfort gnawing at him. The wedding was everything he had hoped for. He was marrying the woman he loved, surrounded by wealth, beauty, and his closest friends. But why couldn't he shake this strange feeling that something was missing? Then, as the vows were being exchanged, he caught a glimpse of something, or rather, someone, that made his heart stop. For a moment everything seemed to freeze. There, standing near the back, was a familiar face. A face he hadn't expected to see today. His ex-wife, Sarah. David's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was she really here? At his wedding? His mind was in a blur, his thoughts a chaotic mess of confusion and disbelief. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her as she stood at the edge of the room, far enough away that she was almost a shadow, yet close enough for him to see her clearly. David had never expected Sarah to show up at his wedding, let alone in this way. What was she doing here? And why was she standing there, so out of place, so distant, yet somehow undeniable? He tried to focus on the ceremony, to concentrate on the woman who was about to become his wife, but all he could do was think of Sarah. The memories, the past they had shared, came rushing back, pulling him away from the present. David's gaze was fixed on her. There, in the back of the room, she stood, unnoticed by everyone else, but painfully impossible for him to ignore. His heart raced, his mind in turmoil. Why was Sarah here, of all places? How had she known about the wedding? And more importantly, why did it feel like she was about to ruin everything he had worked so hard for? Unable to sit in his discomfort any longer, David excused himself from the ceremony. He walked briskly through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed answers. He had to confront her. As he neared Sarah, she seemed to sense his approach, turning her head slightly but not meeting his gaze. The tension in the air was thick, and the seconds felt like hours. David was no longer thinking clearly. His anger and confusion clouded everything. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp with frustration. Sarah's eyes finally met his, and for a moment, David saw something in her he hadn't expected. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't anger, it was something deeper. Pain. Regret. But most of all, resignation. She had known this moment would come, and still, there she was, standing before him as if she had nowhere else to be. "I'm here to work," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. David felt his stomach churn. Work? Why would she be here, of all places, cleaning toilets at his wedding? It didn't make sense. His mind scrambled for answers, but the only thing he could focus on was the sight of her in a maid's uniform, a stark contrast to the glitz and glamour of his wedding. "Work?" he echoed incredulously. "You're cleaning the bathrooms at my wedding? This is where you're at now." Sarah nodded slowly, not even flinching at his words. There was a deep sadness in her expression, but no anger, no bitterness. Just a calm acceptance of a life she had never expected. David's anger flared again, but this time, it was mixed with guilt. He didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong between them. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but instead, he stood there, rooted to the spot, struggling to comprehend the situation. What had happened to Sarah after they divorced? Why was she here, at his wedding, and why did it feel like she had always been a part of this moment? David stood there, speechless, staring at Sarah. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the scene before him. But instead of anger, guilt gnawed at him. How had things ended up like this? "I never thought I'd see you like this," David finally managed to say, his voice shaky with a mix of confusion and hurt. "You've been avoiding me for years, and now, here you are, cleaning bathrooms at my wedding. What happened to you, Sarah?" Sarah's expression softened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She took a step back, her gaze dropping to the floor as though the weight of her words was too much to bear. "David," she whispered, "you have no idea what happened after we divorced. You think I moved on, that it was easy for me. But it wasn't." David's heart tightened as Sarah's voice faltered. He stepped closer, as if drawn by an invisible force, but still, she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she spoke slowly, each word laced with pain. "I lost everything, David. My job, my house, my dignity. Everything crumbled the moment we ended things. I was left with nothing. Except this." She placed a hand gently on her swollen belly. David froze. His mind couldn't grasp what she was saying. His eyes moved from her face to her stomach. His pulse quickened as the reality of her words sank in. "Sarah, you're pregnant?" he asked, almost in disbelief. He looked around, as though the grandeur of the wedding venue could somehow shield him from the enormity of the moment. She nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes. And this baby, David. It's yours." The words hit David like a sledgehammer. His world seemed to collapse in on itself. The wedding, the new life he had carefully constructed, all of it suddenly felt hollow. His chest tightened as the full weight of Sarah's revelation washed over him. His breath caught in his throat. The child she was carrying was his. The one thing he never expected, the one thing he hadn't even considered, was now the undeniable truth. "I didn't want to tell you," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to ruin your life, your wedding. But I couldn't carry this secret any longer. You had a right to know, David. I couldn't do it on my own anymore." David's knees went weak, and he had to lean against the doorframe for support. His mind was a blur of emotions, a whirlwind of shock, guilt, and confusion. He couldn't process it all at once. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Sarah had been through so much, he could see the hurt in her eyes. The weight of it all, the years of struggle she'd faced, and now, the burden of carrying their child. The silence between them stretched on, suffocating. Finally, David found his voice again. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" His words were softer this time, tinged with regret. "I was scared," Sarah admitted quietly. "I thought you'd just walk away from me, like you did before. And maybe you would've. But I couldn't just go on pretending. Not when I'm about to become a mother. David stood there, his chest heaving with emotion. The world around him seemed to blur, his thoughts too jumbled to make sense of. Everything he had worked so hard for, everything he had dreamed of, it all felt like it was slipping away. The woman he once loved, carrying his child, and yet here they were, strangers, lost in their own pain. He didn't know what to say, or even how to begin to process what Sarah had just revealed. All he could do was stand there, in silence, as the enormity of the moment hit him like a wave. David's heart pounded as he walked away from Sarah, the weight of the revelation sinking in. He could still feel the sting of her words, her vulnerability piercing through his armor. But time was running out. He had to face Lisa. He had to tell her the truth, something that would change everything he thought he knew about his life. As he walked into the grand reception hall, the elegant atmosphere felt like a distant memory. The music, the laughter, it all seemed so far away now. Lisa was standing by the bar, talking to a few guests, her radiant smile lighting up the room. But as soon as she saw David, her expression shifted. She could tell something was wrong. "David? What's going on?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. David tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was still reeling from the revelation about Sarah, and now he had to explain it all to Lisa. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. "David, talk to me," Lisa pressed, her hand gently touching his arm. She could see the strain in his eyes, the conflict brewing beneath the surface. She had never seen him like this before, so distant, so unsettled. Finally, David spoke, his voice hoarse. "Lisa, there's something I need to tell you. Something I never expected. Something that changes everything." Lisa's eyes narrowed, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What is it, David? You're scaring me." David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had promised himself that he would be honest, but now, standing in front of Lisa, the truth felt like a crushing weight. "Sarah, she's here. At the wedding. And she's pregnant. And it's my child." The words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she couldn't process what David had just said. Pregnant? With his child? A part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers, but another part of her stood frozen, unable to move. "You're telling me, Sarah, your ex-wife is here? And she's pregnant with your child?" Lisa's voice was trembling, her shock turning into disbelief. She stepped back slightly, as if the news was too much to absorb all at once. David nodded, unable to look her in the eye. "I didn't know, Lisa. I had no idea. I just found out. She told me, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what this means." Lisa stood there, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The room around them seemed to close in. The wedding, the vows, the life they had planned, it all felt like a distant dream now. She had always known David's past with Sarah was complicated, but this was a betrayal of a different magnitude. It wasn't just about their past, it was about the future. Their future. And now, that future was uncertain. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why didn't you tell me this before we got married?" David ran a hand through his hair, his guilt palpable. "I didn't know how to. I thought it was over, that Sarah was in the past. I never imagined this could happen, and now I'm just lost." Lisa took a step back, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that were swirling inside her. Hurt, anger, confusion. She had always believed in their love, in their future together, but now everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. How could she trust him after this? How could she trust anything? "I don't know what to say, David," Lisa finally admitted, her voice cracking. "I love you, but this is too much. I don't know how to handle this." David felt his heart breaking as he watched her retreat into herself. He had broken something that couldn't be fixed easily. The woman he had promised his future to was now looking at him as if he was a stranger. The weight of his decisions, of his past, was finally catching up with him, and he didn't know how to make it right. As Lisa walked away, David stood there, unable to follow. The wedding that was supposed to be the start of their new life now felt like the end of something far more significant. The consequences of his actions were no longer abstract, they were real, and they were staring him in the face. David's thoughts were a chaotic mess as he stepped out of the reception hall, his mind still spinning from the conversation with Lisa. His heart ached, the weight of his choices crushing him. The wedding had turned into a nightmare, and he felt the walls of his perfect life closing in around him. He needed to speak to Sarah. He needed to understand the truth, to know what this all meant, not just for him, but for the child, for their future. He made his way through the empty corridors of the venue, the soft echo of his footsteps a stark contrast to the bustling celebration behind him. Finally, he found her. Sarah was standing alone in a quiet corner, her back to him. She hadn't seen him yet. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him, but his legs felt heavy, like he was walking through a fog. "Sarah," he called softly, his voice betraying the exhaustion in his chest. She turned slowly, as if she had been waiting for him. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness. Just the same quiet sadness that had always lingered between them. "David," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, there was an eerie calm about her, as though she had known this conversation was coming. "I need to understand," David began, his throat tight. "I need to know why you didn't tell me earlier. Why now, at my wedding?" Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving his. She took a step closer, but still, there was a distance between them. "I didn't want to disrupt your life," she explained. "I didn't want to ruin what you've built. You've moved on, David. I didn't want to be the person who dragged you back into this." David's chest tightened at her words. He knew the pain she had carried, the way she had always put others first, even when it cost her everything. But this was different. She was carrying his child. He couldn't just walk away from that. "But I didn't know," David whispered. "I didn't know about the baby. I didn't know I was a father until today." Sarah's gaze softened. "I didn't want you to have to choose between your life and this. I didn't want to come here and disrupt everything. You deserve better than this." David closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had built a life of success, of luxury, but it had all come at a cost. Now, the consequences of his choices were staring him in the face. He had abandoned Sarah. He had left her to struggle alone. And now, the child he never knew existed was a reality he couldn't ignore. "I've been running from this for so long," David admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought I could leave it all behind. I thought I could bury the past and move forward. But I can't. Not now. Not when I know the truth." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I never wanted to burden you, David. I just wanted to make sure the baby had a chance, even if I had to do it alone." David's heart ached for her, for the woman he had once loved, who had carried the weight of their past and their future without ever asking for help, and for the child, who had been caught in the middle of it all. "I'm sorry," David whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. "I should have been there. I should have known." Sarah shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lip. "You can't change the past. But you can make things right, David. For the baby. For both of us." David nodded, his mind finally clearing. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had a choice to make. A decision that would change his life forever. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the child, about Sarah, and about the future they could build, if he was willing to step up. "Thank you," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know what I can do, but I will figure this out. I promise." Sarah looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with hope. "That's all I need to hear." David walked away from Sarah, his mind still racing. He had no answers, no clear path forward. His life, once so carefully constructed, now seemed to be falling apart. The promises he had made to himself, to Lisa, to everyone who depended on him, now felt meaningless in the face of this new truth. The weight of fatherhood, of responsibility, pressed down on him with a force he couldn't ignore. He needed to think. He needed space. But where could he go? Everywhere he turned, there was a reminder of the choices he had made, the mistakes he had buried for so long. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how hard you tried to keep it hidden. And now there was no escaping it. As David sat alone in the quiet of the venue, the once glamorous wedding hall felt empty. The echoes of laughter and joy from earlier seemed distant, replaced by a deafening silence that filled his ears. He thought of Lisa, her face filled with hurt and betrayal. How could he explain this to her? How could he ask her to understand, to accept this new reality? The guilt gnawed at him. He had promised Lisa a future, a life built on trust and love. But how could he give her that now, knowing what he had done? How could he move forward with her, when his past, his choices, loomed so large over their relationship? David buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. His thoughts spiraled in circles. He could feel the pull of his old life, the life he had abandoned for the sake of success, for the illusion of control. He had convinced himself that everything would be fine as long as he focused on his career, on the things that were within his grasp. But now, he realized how hollow that life had been, how empty. But then there was the child, his child, the child he had never known existed until today. His heart ached as he thought about the life that was about to be brought into the world, the innocent soul who would never have asked for any of this. The child didn't deserve to grow up in a broken home, to wonder why their father wasn't there. David knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave Sarah to raise their child alone, even if it meant sacrificing the life he had planned. He had to make a decision that would not only affect him, but also the future of the child, and the future he still wanted with Lisa. But how could he balance it all? How could he reconcile the man he had become with the man he needed to be? As the minutes passed, the answers didn't come. The weight of his struggle was unbearable, the uncertainty of the future more overwhelming than any business deal or financial goal he had ever faced. This wasn't about money or success, it was about family, responsibility, and the mistakes he had made along the way. David stood up, his legs shaky as he took a deep breath. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain, he couldn't ignore this anymore. He had to face it, he had to step up. The question was, would he be able to? David was on the verge of making a decision. His mind had been racing for hours, grappling with the weight of his past and the responsibilities that were now demanding his attention. The life he thought he had was slipping away, and he knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He had to make things right, not just for Sarah, not just for the child, but for Lisa, too. But just as he was about to walk into the room to speak with Lisa, a voice stopped him. David, wait. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes told a different story, one of uncertainty, of something else she hadn't yet revealed. I need to tell you something, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's heart raced again. He had braced himself for so much already, but the way Sarah was looking at him made his stomach churn. What is it? David asked, the tension in his chest building. Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. There's more. About the baby. David felt his throat tighten. What do you mean, more? He asked, his pulse quickening. He had already learned more than he could process. What more could she possibly have to say? I didn't want to tell you this, Sarah continued, but it's important you know now. There's a reason why I didn't tell you sooner. A reason I never could. David's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the new layer of uncertainty that was creeping in. He had always believed that this moment was about accepting responsibility, stepping up to be a father. But now, it felt as though everything was shifting beneath him, slipping through his fingers. Sarah, just tell me. What is it? I didn't want you to know this, she said again, her voice trembling slightly. But the baby. It might not be yours. The words hit David like a cold wave, freezing him in place. He stared at Sarah, unable to comprehend what she had just said. His heart stopped for a moment as the full weight of her words sank in. "What?" was all he could manage to say. The room felt like it was spinning, his world suddenly off balance. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "David, I'm sorry. But after we separated, I wasn't the only one in my life. There was someone else." David stood motionless, his mind racing. The child, his child, might not even be his? How could this be happening? After everything, after all the pain, the guilt, the responsibility he had just begun to accept, now this? "I don't know who the father is," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen, but when I found out I was pregnant, I couldn't keep track of everything. The truth is, I don't know who the father is. I didn't want you to have to deal with that. I wanted you to think. I wanted you to believe it was yours." David's head was spinning. Every plan, every decision, everything he had just begun to understand seemed to unravel in front of him. The child he thought was his, the responsibility he had been preparing for, it was all built on a lie. "I didn't want to hurt you," Sarah whispered. "But I couldn't keep living the lie." David stepped back, feeling as though the floor beneath him was crumbling. His heart was racing, his mind unable to focus. Everything he thought he knew, every choice he had made, was now in question. He had been ready to take responsibility. He had been ready to build a future for the child he thought was his. But now, with this revelation, everything felt uncertain. Everything was broken. David stood there, the weight of Sarah's words crashing down on him. His world had shifted so violently that he didn't know how to find his footing. Everything he had planned, everything he thought he understood, had just been torn apart. The baby wasn't his. But still, his mind kept circling back to the same question: what now? He looked at Sarah, who was standing in front of him, her face a mixture of pain and regret. "You've got to understand, David," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you from the truth." David closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. The life he had envisioned was slipping away, and yet, the responsibility he felt towards the child still lingered in his heart. He had always wanted a family, he had always wanted to be a good man. But now, it seemed like everything he had done to build that future was meaningless. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the tension between them. David turned to walk away, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Please," she said, her tone desperate, "don't walk away from me now." David turned back slowly, looking at her for the first time with a clarity he hadn't felt before. He realized something deep inside: this wasn't just about the child. It was about facing the man he had become. It was about owning the past, the choices he had made, and deciding whether or not he could live with them. "I don't know what to do," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to walk away, but I can't. Not from you. Not from this." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she nodded, understanding. For the first time, they were both standing in the same reality, facing the mess they had created together. The future was still uncertain, but David knew one thing: he wasn't going to run away anymore. "I have to make things right," he said, his voice firming up. "I'm not sure how, but I'm not walking away from this. I can't." With those words, something inside David shifted. The weight on his shoulders didn't disappear, but it felt more bearable now. He didn't have all the answers, but he was ready to confront the consequences of his past and try to build something better, something real. As he looked at Sarah, he saw a glimpse of hope in her eyes, a sign that they might not be as broken as he once thought. The future was uncertain, yes, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work, together. As the night drew to a close, David felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The wedding, the promises, the perfect future, everything crumbled in an instant. His life lay in ruins. But in the midst of it all, one undeniable truth stood. He had to face the consequences of his past, no matter what it cost. He walked back into the reception hall, the once vibrant celebration now a distant memory. His fiancée, Lisa, was still there, her face reflecting the hurt and confusion she had carried since the moment she learned the truth. David knew he had to make things right with her too, but the path ahead wasn't simple. It would require facing the consequences of his actions, owning his past, his mistakes, and making the hard choices. As he took a deep breath, David realized that this wasn't just about what he had lost, but about what he still had the chance to rebuild. His journey was far from over, but one thing was certain: he was no longer running from the truth.